Hey,
Hey, how are you?
good. How you doing, man?
Great. You can hear and see me all right?
Yep. Likewise.
Awesome. Yeah, for sure. Awesome. And I appreciate your promptness.
Yeah, no worries. My buddy Pete, one of our producers, is also going to join. I don't know if
Oh,
he's in the
very
room
cool.
yet. Sure. And what's the vision for this particular episode? 'Cause just looking
This
at.
no, this not a vision. This is more like it's more of not really part of my conversation series. This is going to be more of a promo to help talk about the recording, talk about you, the foundation. This is not going to be related to that specifically at all. It's more to
Oh, cool.
leverage that audience to help grow more awareness towards you, the foundation, the recordings, the sonic journals, to try to promote that and help people be more aware of it and to hopefully maybe, contribute back to the
Awesome.
whole idea
Yeah.
behind this. So that's what this is about. This is not specifically like a Jerry Church where we're just going to talk about Jerry. No, 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 no.
Okay. I
My
was
questions.
trying to make sure I understood the tie-in.
No, of
With
course.
all.
No, the tie-in is just leveraging my audience of deadheads and audiophiles and music lovers who obviously adore Owsley for many years because of his affiliation and his recordings and everything like that. And this is a bit to dive a bit deeper into the foundation, into this particular release, and
Sure.
to hear more about you and your mission and to sort of tie all that back together. And we obviously know where it came from in that regard, but no, this is mainly about you, us, and my questions all around the recording itself, the foundation and stuff like that. So just glad we got
Okay.
to clarify
Cool.
that. Cool.
And will it be mixing in music from the new release or from other
No,
releases,
no,
or it just be
I
a
won't.
conversation?
The reason why I don't do that is because being on YouTube, there's a potential for copyright infringement. And
Right.
so what I was going to propose, actually, if this is something you'd be interested in, I'd be willing to test those waters. I'd be more than willing to convert. I know that the Owsley Foundation is very big on audio quality, and compressing audio for YouTube could be a problem. However, see, I've done my research. So there's a potential I could, as a one-off for a 24-hour period, take this release or any of your releases or any future releases and actually premiere that to my audience with a live chat, everyone chat about it, and then 24 hours yank it. That way it's not about it staying up there. It's more about making people aware. So that's something we can definitely talk about, down the road as another option, to encourage more engagement and get more people talking about this.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, this is strictly just conversation about the everything in general.
Got it. Okay. No, very good. This is my buddy Pete.
Hey, Pete.
He's a
Hey,
producer,
David.
one of the executive producers on this release, and has been with the foundation since day one, really.
Awesome. Well, it's great to be connected, Pete, as well. Thank you for your time too. And again, this is really about you guys. And I'm going to ask some questions and talk as long as you want until our clock obviously runs out with the Zoom time. But this is really about you guys I've got my questions. I've done my research. I listened to the
Cool.
recording, read the liner notes, and did a little bit more research on the website. So this is all going to be curated around that. There may be some questions you've heard many, many years ago, but this is not about that. It's about hopefully some new listeners and a new audience to kind of grow that base for you guys as well.
Yeah, no, it sounds great.
David, are we edited and are we audio and visual?
Yes, we are audio and visual right now. We're
Okay.
being recorded. Correct. Yeah.
But will it be edited?
I will cut out the beginnings when you guys weren't here in the end. I mean, if there's anything about this, no, I usually just upload the raw recording as is. I'm not typically a video editor kind of guy. I'm sort of like a hack who has a lot of skills and just makes things work. That's what I do, is I just get it done. So if there's something in this we don't like, absolutely. I mean, I've had a couple of interviews where someone wanted to cut something out. Absolutely, it can be done. But glad we clarified that, because I could actually start the recording from here if we wanted, and leave all that stuff out too. So happy to do it either way. I prefer sort of the casualness of it. It's it's not formal, just having fun kind of thing.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Awesome.
So why don't we? Yeah. Well, do whatever formal introduction, and we'll just start it from here. Then.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna get to. I mean, now I didn't know Pete was joining, so we can get to Pete a little bit. I'll work in a bit more about Pete a little bit later on. That's no issues there, no problem at all. But first, again, thanks again for your time. It's great to be connected. I just want to start by saying the dynamics of this specific recording are simply fantastic. And for anybody listening to this, I highly recommend to all audiophiles in general. Not even if you're not an Owsley, have no idea who he is. Doesn't matter, a bear or anything else. I highly recommend this just because it truly is a wonderful capture of a historic performance in that regard. And it's a real testament to something else importantly. Bear's approach to music recording, 3D spatial sound, and his experimentation using that particular carousel ballroom as sort of his sonic lab, so to speak. So it really has a lot of, to it in that sense. And it's just interesting that, this is my first conversation and my first real dive in with this particular, the Bear Sonic Journals. And for me, what an awesome place to depart from outside of, a Grateful Dead experience or a Jerry Band experience. So that's really been really cool to me. And what I read in the liner notes about the recording specifically, which I found to be really cool. I mean, I work with sound engineers all the time. So this is, they've obviously, a lot of them have learned some of Bear's techniques over the years and apply them. That Johnny's voice and guitar are on the left channel and the Tennessee 3 are on the right channel. Can you talk more about that for those who have not obviously heard the recording or have not read the liner notes, and what the specificity about that, how the carousel, how that kind of blended itself in, and what that meant to you guys in the recording itself?
Sure. We'll give it a shot. And Starfinder is actually Owsley's son is the best at addressing this question and probably has the keenest insight into his father's techniques. But we'll do the best that we can. I want to say it's Bear was about sound quality above all, and his goal as the sound man was to get the sound to every seat in the house and have it have the same clarity and the same strength, and didn't want it just to go to that sweet spot in the center of the room, so many feet from the stage, and have that be the only place in the house that it sounded good in. So he started making his tapes as a way of capturing how the room sounded on any given night so that he could evaluate his performance as the sound man. And what he was trying to do with that 2-track recorder and understanding all the limitations of a 2-track at the time was to capture as best he could the sound in the venue on a 2-track.
Yeah.
And what that means is, in order to get the separation without overlap, that he would put certain instruments, typically the PA and the vocal mic would be on the left side generally at the carousel, and run that to one channel. And then the rest of the instruments run that to the second channel, which creates some odd matchups in terms of the balance of the separation. But he did it that way in part because he didn't want to compromise on the sound quality by having duplicative information on both channels.
Mm.
And so that what ends up happening is, on a tape like this, and this may be cart before the horse in terms of explanation of how we ended up, with this preserved sound this way. Every time we tried to bring Johnny's voice to center from where it's panned way over to the left, we lost some of the sound quality off of Luther's plucking on the right. And that trade-off is a compromise in actual sound quality that we couldn't endure. Whereas with the separation problem, that's its own issue in terms of the unusual sound that creates, sort of splitting your brain into left and right as you listen. But in terms of actual sound quality, that was the best way to present this to the world. It's the way that Bear recorded it. He recorded it that way for a reason. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason may have been informed to some extent by the Beatles with their wide panning in the same way on the early Beatles albums. It was not as uncommon to record in that fashion back then, but I will say that after about 1968, Owsley moved away from that and created a more conventional mix. So what you're hearing here ultimately is technology advancing. This, the Carousel Ballroom was his experimental sound lab, where he got to set up the stage in whatever configuration or array that he wanted. He could tinker to his heart's content in the middle of a performance, after a performance, during, and he did. Yeah. And so you've got this period in his recording practice. I mean, these were his reps, where he was experimenting with this technique, and he found it to be a very effective way to capture what the hall sounded like on that night. And it's important to sort of mention also that it had to do with, he liked omni mics. Mm-hmm. He didn't close mic. We've learned more and more that the way he was able to capture the way a room felt, which is sort of his sort of secret sauce, was in the way that he mic'd and the mic placement. Yeah. And what we had always, when I started doing this, being back with the Doc Watson release, I thought it sounded so clear because everything was so close mic'd. But that's not what Owsley's actually doing. He's creating the space on the stage. And the interesting thing about watching Johnny Cash in the Tennessee 3 is, if you look at pictures from this era, Johnny is actually way over on the left, and the Tennessee 3 are clustered on the right. And it's, the sound stage that's created from these recordings actually does put you in the room, but we're also very sympathetic to the fact that 15 million, Johnny Cash fans are not used to hearing Johnny this way.
Fair enough. Yeah,
And
true that.
it's going to be somewhat polarizing to an audience that is used to sort of the conventional Johnny Cash sound. To hear him like this requires a particular tilt of will to a certain extent. And Bear would tell you to
Push the speakers
push
together.
your speakers together. So when we listen, this is one of the setups that we listen on. We've created our own single point system, and that separation issue is a complete wash at that point. It's not, you get all the clarity and none of the jarring distance between the two speakers.
So
and
it's almost not made for the headphone experience per se, right? But you need
it's
to have
really
it
not,
set up almost like that, and it becomes a whole different, like you said, like it's almost like the record player versus something else, and it's a whole unique experience in of itself, not just because of the way it was recorded, but also how you need to listen to it to to kind of tie it all back together in its own way without oversaturation or losing some part of it or something like that. It's really cool, and it's amazing how that your response are kind of almost tied into my next comment about that. I mean, because Owsley's legendary status is obvious for the recordings and his ever evolving equipment innovations, and you already touched on that, and it's amazing how you just segued into that for me automatically. I mean, what made this acoustic unplugged recording so revolutionary? We touched on that too, because obviously it was Bear's approach to acoustic, which may have been different than electric. And I mean, you touched on that, but is there anything else more that you may be aware of? I know you said Starfinder may be the better person for that, but how that, I mean, maybe you've already mentioned, and how that approach towards an acoustic setup versus an electric setup, or was it more the same thing and it was just, again, trial and error, and just that was the beauty of his genius, was to be able to troubleshoot or A/B test, if you would have a marketing person, on the fly almost instantaneously to really get that, or to be able to carry knowledge from one show specific to that venue to the next time or the next time, and learn and grow from that. Any feedback on that difference between the electric and the acoustic arrangement approach?
I mean, it's tough for us, without Bear here to tell us.
Of course.
We're really looking at it empirically based on what you hear in the recordings from one to another. But what I loved in our first three releases, so we have Doc Watson, which is a mostly acoustic trio, except for T. Michael Coleman on electric bass, but it really is an acoustic show. Then you go to the Allman Brothers, much bigger configuration, 2 drummers, and of course Owsley knew how to mic 2 drummers, in 1970, with the Grateful Dead, Mickey and Billy. And then you move to Jack and Yorma, which is an interesting parallel to the Doc Watson. It's the electric side of the trio. So you've got an acoustic trio essentially, and then you've got the electric trio, a very different sound that they got out of their instruments. But my theory is that Owsley's approach would have largely been the same, that it was all about sort of constructive leakage, mic placement, and if you don't like the way it sounds, move the mics.
Yeah.
If you still don't like the way it sounds, get a better mic. And that sort of willingness to continue to push the technology, to experiment, to make mistakes, to take 3 steps forward, go 2 steps back, that was very much part of the process. Now, as opposed electric versus acoustic, how he chose to mic it on any given night, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. No, I figured as much, but you never know. Sometimes, being who you are and your affiliation, there may have been a little bit more knowledge of that. So no, that's great. I mean, I work with sound guys all the time. I mean, especially with the band I tour with, and it used to always be sound. He always wanted to do audience recordings, and I was like, "There's too many chatters, too many chomp. We can't hear it because there's." So I made him do soundboards, and then what he does now is he puts in audience mics on the stage to capture the ambience, because it just gives that recording a little bit more life, because you can hear the bouncing off the walls and the people there and enjoying it differently, where a soundboard, sometimes, as much as it's crystal clear, usually in most cases, it does take away a bit of that roomness and the ambience that Bear obviously over the years captured so well. And when I do other shows on my channel, sometimes I do a Friday fan jam and I actually pick a Grateful Dead show. People will say, "Why'd you pick an audience recording?" And I'm like, "Are you listening to this? There's a reason why I picked an audience recording, because the soundboards just didn't do the show justice in any way, shape, or form." And so, it's a combination of those different techniques, whether it be mic placement, to get a soundboard that sounds like an audience sort of soundboard hybrid, right? At the end of the day, and that's
Yeah.
as opposed to doing one or the other. It's kind of a mixed match of both. And I found
And Owsley never put a sound mic in the audience. He and he had his own sort of separate tape decks that he wasn't patching into the board
Yeah.
per se. He had two sets of mics essentially. So the house mics, and then you've got his recording mics that would run to, his MX10, Ampex MX10.
yeah, it's like he multi-tracked before there was multi-tracking, right? It's pretty
Yeah,
awesome.
I mean, yeah, he basically strung two decks together to get up to eight mics, typically depending on what era and
For sure.
what he was able to bring to the gig.
And in fact, we're working on a recording now that is acoustic, and the acoustic instruments. I'm sorry, I can't say who it is, but the acoustic instruments have a very wide dynamic range, and so from the difference between the loudest and the softest instrument would drive most soundmen crazy, but Bear nailed it. And when we started to listen, we were with listening in a studio with a very famous sound man. And he was coming in cold. So his initial take was this had to have been close mic'd at each instrument going into a many track recorder. But then we got to talk to another sound man who was an eyewitness to this gig. The gig was in the 70s. And he said, no, in fact, that's not what Bear did. What Bear did was a lot like what we're talking about now. Bear would essentially sample the best seat in the house. And what I mean by that is he was placing Omni mics around the stage, moving the Omni mics and trying to get the feeling of what would it sound like to be in the best seat of the house. And it's just, it shows that he can mic acoustic, he can mic electric with this technique. And there's some sonic alchemy going on there.
Yeah,
but a whole lot of thought, a whole lot of consideration for it's not just about clarity, and that's where you get the close miking, is you get this antiseptic sound where you get the mics right up inside the instrument and you don't get a sense of space.
Mm-hmm.
Owsley was trying to capture a different type of information about what it sounded like, as Pete said, in the best room in the house, like what it sounded like to the house without having to run an audience mic.
Yeah, and then like you say, then expand that. So this is the best seat in the house. How do we then pull that out so every seat in the house has that essentially? And how do we tweak or shift the placement just enough or a certain frequency that may help give that? And obviously that's really cool. And I mean, hearing that, please pay.
Well, and it gets even better. So, on this recording, he recorded the same band a few years earlier in a different venue. And we compared the two recordings, and one sounds like this close miking technique. It sounds like you're up on stage with the band. The other sounds like, a grand theater, a huge hall. So one sounds like a little intimate club, one sounds like a grand hall. Again, we were talking to this sound man who was an eyewitness and knew Bear's techniques for both places. And he said, no, in fact, he was using almost the same miking technique in both locations. So what you're hearing is actually not the difference between how Bear mic'd. What you're hearing is the difference in how those two halls sounded. You're hearing what it would have sounded like to have been in the audience at one hall versus the other, which is astonishing. So Bear called these sonic journals. He said, this is what it sounded like to be in that room that night. And so we're very excited for this future release because you'll get to compare two different halls, and it's astonishing.
Wow.
Yeah, what it does is it fully illustrates why Owsley made his tapes in the first place, what he was trying to accomplish in them.
And it made me subconscious too, at the time, this is what he loved and what he did. And you know what I mean? He was an innovator in himself, and he had no idea maybe how it would get used one day, if ever, right? It was just, how can I make this the best I can right now and take from that and hear the difference in a room, versus that. And that's sometimes I will say, sometimes I'll have someone on my channel when I'm doing a show, they say, I've heard this before. And I'm like, but have you heard this recording? Because sometimes a different recording of the same show will give you a different understanding and a different total vibe of it, right? And so I will do that where sometimes deadheads will look, oh, I've heard that recording from many years ago. Oh, but there was a new release in circulation that just came out that you haven't heard.
Yes.
Let's try this one out. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, what a different experience that was because of some of the things that you're talking about in this regard where little shifts, whether it be mic placement or room or whatever it might be in that regard. I'm not a sound person specifically, but I get it. I understand it from a, obviously a fundamental point of view and how it makes me feel. But really cool to hear that little again about the new release and the comparison of the two, same recording, I mean, same band, but different venues and how you can feel like you're in one venue versus the other. And that's really interesting. I'm excited about this new recording. Obviously, we don't know about it yet, but so having said that, I mean, this was something that's interesting to me too, because I did notice, how many releases there currently are. And obviously this was going to be my question about are there more in the pipeline, but so like, how do you guys specifically select the shows? I mean, I did read there's, over 1,300, in the archive or whatnot. So like, how does that process look like? I mean, is it like a triage? I know that there's a lot of these have lifespans and they're running out. So it's like, okay, these are the oldest ones. We're going to try to look at these ones first before, they're totally gone. Or is there like an actual, obviously there's a curation process to some degree, but I'm curious to, what that process looks like and actually selecting which show or which performance or recording and how that then comes and becomes an actual produced album.
Yeah, well, we're more than 900 reels of the 1,300 have been preserved. So we're really into the last leg of the preservation push. In the early days, there were really three criteria that we were looking for: unusual combinations of artists, historically significant concert, or essentially the jeopardy that the tape was in. And we started with oldest first, thinking that the oldest would be in the most jeopardy. What we realized fairly early on was that our those Ampex tapes from the mid '60s were actually pretty solid tapes. They were preserved pretty well. They were they were maintained with the Grateful Dead archive until the early aughts, and have been maintained in climate controlled conditions throughout their life. So they were in better shape. They were in good shape. What we found was that some of the tapes manufactured in the mid '70s and early '80s were the ones that were actually in the worst shape and exhibited most shedding in the process of preserving them. So we don't listen to anything recreationally. What we do is assume that any tape that's targeted for preservation is going to disintegrate when we preserve it. And we adhere to strict protocols in that regard. So tapes that are unmarked and we don't know what they are, tapes that have very enticing comments, but it's still not clear entirely what it is. We don't necessarily, we don't know what's on them. We don't mark them for preservation until there's, until their turn, basically.
Gotcha.
In the early days, we did spend more time sort of cherry picking what looked like it would be the most exciting to preserve soonest. But we are now going back with the last 400 or so, and very systematically going year by year and box by box to catch any stragglers.
Well, yeah, the process evolves, right, over time. It's like, you know what I mean? And that's why, because it might have started off, as you said, one way, oldest tapes, triage, which one's going to blow, but then it realized after a while that it may not have been those. So the focus shifted because at the end of the day, if the goal is preservation, as you said, the other stuff isn't really relevant at this point, right?
Yeah, it's all got to get saved.
Like you make assumptions, right? You said you make assumptions, but really it's how do we preserve this as quickly and as efficiently, but as best as possible, and then we'll kind of deal with the other stuff after the fact, right? Because it's almost like you're working backwards, and that's really in a lot of ways how my marketing works too. And it's like, I got to do a couple shows to see what the audience responds, and then I tweak it, or then I very much like a sound recording, right? It's the process is ever evolving in that regard. So it's really cool to have that extra insight about that because. I can see what albums or what sonic recordings have been released. I'm like, there's no real rhyme or reason to that difference in bands other than, like you said, maybe we're trying to break it up and show a little bit of different variants to the music types and whatnot. But then again, hearing this kind of gives a bit more clarity to that whole process.
But let's not get confused between the preservation process and the release process.
No, really for sure, absolutely not.
Two different tracks.
Of course.
And, there's a pipeline of release projects or potential release projects. We usually have about 10 or 15 in some state of production. And the ones where we have the most positive support from the artist are the ones that get moved
Become
up
releases.
ahead. And each one of those in turn takes an unpredictable amount of time just to sort of negotiate with the artists, negotiate with labels if we need to, deal with the
Copyright.
artwork and the mastering process and all that. So we don't, it's funny, we didn't really have a production order. We knew that Doc Watson was going to be our first release because it's magnificent. The Allman Brothers was, have you heard the story about how the Allman Brothers release became our second release?
I did not hear the story, no.
Well, Starfinder, just before Doc Watson came out, we had learned when we were doing the Doc Watson liner notes, Pete had interviewed T. Michael Coleman, and T. Michael Coleman told Pete the only time he was nervous, or the only time he saw Doc Watson nervous was when he played at a bluegrass brunch for Jimmy Carter at the White House. And people were talking over the performance. And Jimmy Carter stood up, took the microphone, and interrupted the people that were having their brunch on the lawn and said, "You got to listen to this guy is an American treasure. Y'all need to pay attention." And then he hands the microphone back to Doc, and Doc says, "Oh, you make me nervous, Jimmy." And so we had heard that story when we were in production, and then President Carter had a health scare, and Starfinder sent him the box set. He was the first person in the country to receive a copy of the box set before it was released.
Wow.
With our well wishes. And a couple months later, he wrote a lovely, very presidential letter back to Starfinder, thanking him, in a nice fat paragraph, thanking him for his thoughtfulness. And he said, "Rosalind," the last line was, "and Rosalind and I look forward to your Allman Brothers release."
Awesome.
So
Yeah, I knew
then
he was a big fan, that's for sure.
Yeah, he's a big fan. So then we called the Allman Brothers, and they said, "Oh, we were wondering who we should contact at the Owsley Stanley Foundation. We've been, wanting to produce the Fillmore tape again." And so that's how we got to number 2.
It's amazing
But
when you use a line like that.
beyond
Absolutely.
that, the arc of the releases is really designed, and this is intentional, just how things percolate up to the top at any given time. But we have a narrative arc that we're trying to demonstrate that covers the diversity of artists that Owsley recorded, and it's absolutely intentional that you're seeing a diverse array of folks, and it's part of what I hope keeps people interested in what we're doing, and also sort of demonstrates just how intertwined the range of music was in the Bay Area. In
Oh,
the
yeah.
70s. Everybody was listening to everything.
That's where my time machine's going. It's not going to ancient Egypt, it's going there. A couple of Matrix shows, old days, whatever, all the good stuff is created. But you actually touched on a whole bunch of actually answered a bunch of my other my questions. And, in terms of, is there anything else in the pipeline? And, how, obviously if all the ducks are in a row, how long, forget about the copywriting becoming an actual CD, and in terms of the actual archiving process or the preservation, how long does it take to preserve one recording specific? Obviously, if it's in somewhat of an easier process and there isn't a lot of, surgery that needs to be done to it per se, is it, a relatively quick and easy thing? Is it days, weeks? Or just curious how that, how long?
No, for any given reel, it's a matter of hours.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, no, it's not, it doesn't take more time than running the reel.
Fair enough. Yeah. So it's just a matter of rerunning it to somewhere else.
Right. But we have a preservation protocol that was prepared based on the Grammy archiving protocol. We made some adjustments to fit our model as well. But generally we follow that protocol. And based on a visual inspection and other observable details, Jeffrey Norman, our engineer and chief preservationist, will decide whether the tape needs to be baked or not, for example. And so there are adjustments that sometimes need to be made depending on the condition of the tape. But by and large, it's not an extensive process in terms of days or hours to preserve. But the documentation, of course, is ongoing. So each tape will get logged, photographed, notes will be entered into the database. But then we're always also collecting stories from eyewitnesses, and sometimes talking to the bands about it, and trying to gather as much information as we can to throw into the arc.
Yeah, it's a historical archival process, not just we're just preservation music. We're trying to create a future, learning or database, if you want to call it, of just how it all kind of lines up and sinks in, and all as much as you can gather while people are still alive to obviously keep that, you know, historical reference point alive. That's amazing. I really appreciate that, a little bit extra knowledge of that, because again, like, I'm a hack. I do what I do. And I mean, I've obviously taught myself new techniques over time. Like my first Jerry Church had one still image. Now I do like 10, you know, and sometimes I'll do a set 2, like, okay, set 2 starting now, just to give people, you know, I used to be a party planner. So I know you have to hold hands sometimes and take people down the road and show people the way. And sometimes it's not always as obvious. And so I've had to adapt and grow even my knowledge base on what I do to sort of accommodate my users and sort of like, but not take away from, you know, my process and how I do it. It's more trying to give the finished product a bit more polish so that it's more, you know, palpable, or it actually has worth or value to it, right? And so I appreciate that. Next thing, we've only got about 8 minutes left in the Zoom just because we're in a group setting. So I wanted to touch a bit about yourself or Pete. So how did, like, were you born into the foundation? You know, like, is that like, how did the, you know, how did that journey look like? I mean, I'm sure you've seen a dead show somewhere down the road, and, you know, potentially that may have started the whole thing or not. I mean, being in the Bay Area, and that may have just been a kind of thing that happened. So before we get into, like, you know, where people can purchase the albums, I mean, I know the website, I'm going to include all that stuff in the video description and stuff like that, links out to the foundation and whatnot. Just curious about your journeys, both of you, with the foundation. And maybe, I know your role, Hawk. I know all the different titles and hats you've worn over the years, right down to being probably a sweeper inside the house at times. So, you know, just a little bit about you guys and your journey, because again, it's not just about us, it's about the foundation as a whole. And I also know that the foundation is run entirely by volunteers, everybody, and it relies on, you know, donations and tips, and not tips, but people purchasing the albums and whatnot, and contributions to really, you know, help the foundation preserve what's left, and to, you know, churn and keep it going and for future generations. So just a little bit about that in terms of, you know, yourselves, and, you know, a little bit about the foundation as well, and what that journey's been looking like.
Sure, Pete, you want to go first?
Pete, please.
Well, you know, like you said, we're all volunteers. This is a labor of love. We want to see this music preserved and brought back into the world. You know, I didn't know Bear well, but I did meet him. But I've known his son Starfinder since I was a teenager, and I spend time as a journalist, so and as a magazine editor. So to me, each release is a lot like a magazine, in that it's a way to tell a story in different media. So it's pictures, it's sound, it's stories from people, it's histories, and it's artwork, it's photography. So it's bringing all that together. So I care a lot about the story that goes around each piece.
It makes sense. It makes sense, because Bear captured the storytellers, and you guys are trying to keep that story alive. That's amazing. Thanks for that, Pete. And yourself, Hawk.
Yeah, it's a very similar story. Friends with Starfinder, friends with Owsley before Starfinder, actually. I met Bear at a Dead show. You know, the New Yorker, when they interviewed us for that Talk of the Town piece, the fact checkers forced me to go back and figure out exactly which show it was. It turns out it was Raleigh in 1990 was when I met Bear. And we discussed bodybuilding and diet, 2 of his favorite subjects, and wow, became kind of informal tour lifting partners. He was in his bodybuilding phase back then. He was absolutely ripped. I mean, just massive for a man of his short stature. So we trained together, and after about a year, he said, you should come meet my son, Starfinder. And he had me come up to Albany, New York, and see the Dead shows, the Dozin' at the Knicks shows, I believe. And Starfinder and I have been best friends ever since. And Pete and I went to college together at the same time, and introduced Pete to Starfinder and Bear. And when Bear died in a car wreck in Australia, you know, before he had died, he told his children that he wanted them to preserve his tapes for history. And Bear was really, that was something that he was always interested in. The technology just hadn't caught up to his ambitions. And then, of course, he ran out of time. And so when we looked into the cost of preserving the tapes, we figured by our calculations, it was essentially 2 engineers working full time every day for 2 years. And it had a price tag associated with it that none of us could afford. So we formed a nonprofit, and that was in 2012. And we didn't get our first, really, it's one thing to form a company, it's another to bring in money to be able to actually do anything with it. And that's when the Grateful Dead and Hot Tuna basically came to the rescue. And on the Fare Thee Well tour, that 5-show mini tour, there you go. Yeah. For the 50th anniversary, they invited
Actually,
us.
that poster in the corner.
Oh, nice. Yeah. They invited us to be one of their charitable organizations to and receive proceeds from their charitable auction that went along with participation row. And,
That's fantastic.
that was our first seed money. And then Jack and Yorma did a benefit show for us in November 2015. And between those two events, that's when we really started the preservation process in earnest. And then we realized after the Doc Watson release that if we did a couple of these a year, that would take
help.
the place of the
Yeah,
capital
so
campaign.
I was going to ask, like, what is the frequency? Like, is that sort of like it's here and there? We don't always know the frequency. I mean, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but that we'll touch on this. So obviously there's plans. There's one in the pipeline right now. Do we anticipate, 2 releases a year, maybe more if that all works out? Like, so what do we anticipate, if at all? Is there a frequency that in the future? And on top of that, please, where can, please shout out any website addresses where people can purchase this information. Like I said, I'm going to include all those links in the bottom video description, but if that's part of the mentioning process about, frequency, how can people purchase this? How can people help contribute? I know there's links and there's donation links on the website, which I saw earlier today, and I'm going to obviously push those out and tag people in that as well to see if we can get some other contributions, which a little bit more on your guys' side in terms of, how often and how can people find you guys and reach out and get in touch if they want to learn more or contribute or be a part of something.
Sure. I think our goal would be to have 4 a year. But we had 3 in 1 year and it just about killed us. We are all volunteers, so we have day jobs and families and other obligations. So we do this as we can. We love to do it, but it just takes so long. I think 2 a year is probably what we're going to average out. It was great to get 3 out a year, but I don't know that that's sustainable.
Awesome. Well, like I said, I've only got another minute left on this timer here, but I really want to say thank you guys for your time today. And, if there's any opportunity in the future, Dennis did send me the Tim Buckley stuff previously, and he did talk about me potentially speaking with Starfinder about that. So, but again, any other new releases, anything else, if you ever want to chat or, connect with me for the, me to getting in front of my audience for any reason, like I said, if you ever want to give me an album to, put up on my YouTube, I know the sound quality would be a little bit compressed, but I'm happy to, run a premiere or even do a live stream with it and contribute any way that I can. It's a labor of love for me too. Although I'm not an engineer and a technician and all those things, I facilitate sort of that middle piece, and I'm happy to contribute and give back any way that I can. So feel free to reach out anytime in the future and include me in anything. And if I have the time and availability, I'll definitely, turn my hat around and help out any way that I can.
Much appreciated, man.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, guys, thank you again so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed listening to the album, and I look forward to what's coming out next. And I thank you for your time today.
Awesome.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
All the best, guys. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.